John's screams echoed through the pitch-black cave, muffled by stone and swallowed by the earth. His body was wedged upside down in a passage no wider than a mailbox, his chest crushed by immovable rock, his head pounding with blood rushing in reverse. He tried to breathe, but every inhale felt stolen. Rescuers' headlamps cut through the darkness as ropes strained and pulleys squealed under pressure. Then, a sharp snap. The system failed. Silence fell. And in that silence, the clock on John Edward Jones' life began to run out. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. When people hear the name John Edward Jones, they often think of the tragedy, the cave, the headlines. They think of that November night when the ground seemed to swallow a young man whole. But before he was a symbol of one of the most haunting cave accidents in modern history, John was simply John. A husband, a brother, a son, a father-to-be. To truly understand the weight of his story, you have to step back in time, to see the life he built and the man he was before the earth claimed him. John was born on January 21, 1983, in a family where faith was more than ritual, it was the backbone of daily life. He grew up in a household filled with the sounds of laughter, prayer, and the kind of warmth that only comes when a family truly cherishes one another. His parents raised him with deep-rooted values: service to others, devotion to God, and the belief that every moment is a gift worth living fully. These values would shape not only the choices he made but also the way people remembered him long after he was gone. From an early age, John had that spark, that curiosity about the world that set him apart. He was the kid who asked why instead of just what. If a rock caught his eye, he wanted to know where it came from. If there was a tree to climb, John was the first one pulling himself upward. Adventure wasn't a pastime for him, it was almost written into his DNA. Not wild, reckless adventure, but the kind born from curiosity, the kind that made him want to see and understand the world, even if it meant squeezing into spaces most people wouldn't dare to enter. That spirit carried into his teenage years, but so did something else: responsibility. John wasn't just the adventurous type, he was the dependable one. Friends and family leaned on him, and he carried that weight with quiet strength. He was the sort of person you could call at midnight when your car broke down, and he'd show up without a second thought. He had a natural way of making people feel safe, even when life itself was unpredictable. But John's life was not just about curiosity and duty, it was about faith. He was a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and his beliefs guided him in everything he did. Those who knew him often described him as gentle, compassionate, and deeply sincere. He was not the kind of man who wore his faith as a badge of pride, but rather as a compass that quietly directed him in how he treated others, how he loved his family, and how he faced life's challenges. After graduating from high school, John set out on a mission trip for his church, a pivotal period that not only strengthened his faith but also deepened his sense of empathy and purpose. He returned home with a sharper vision for his life, one rooted in both service and ambition. He wanted to build a future where he could help others, where his curiosity could be put to work in meaningful ways. That desire ultimately led him to pursue a career in medicine. By 2009, John was in the thick of medical school at the University of Virginia. He had chosen pediatrics, a field that perfectly reflected his heart. He loved children, loved the idea of nurturing, guiding, and healing the most vulnerable among us. His classmates admired his work ethic, his humility, and the way he made people laugh even in the most stressful times. He had that rare ability to lighten the heaviest atmosphere, a quality that made him not just a colleague but a friend. But of all the titles John held, student, son, brother, the one he cherished most was husband. He married Emily, the love of his life, in the Salt Lake City LDS Temple. Their relationship was one built on trust, affection, and a shared dream of building a family rooted in the same love and values they both held dear. Emily often said that John made her feel like she was the only person in the world, even when they were surrounded by others. He had that laser focus, the ability to make someone feel seen, truly seen, in a way that was rare and unforgettable. At the time of the tragedy, Emily was pregnant with their second child. Their first little one was still just a toddler, and John embraced fatherhood with the same energy he brought to everything else in life. He loved reading bedtime stories, playing on the floor, and planning for a future filled with milestones he couldn't wait to witness. To him, life was about building memories, building a family, building a legacy of kindness and faith. That Thanksgiving week of 2009, John returned home to Utah to spend time with his family. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a reunion filled with laughter, food, and traditions. For John and his siblings, it was also an opportunity to revisit some of the adventures of their youth, specifically the caves that dotted the Utah landscape. Caving or spelunking had always been a favorite pastime. For John, it wasn't about adrenaline or danger. It was about curiosity, discovery, and bonding with the people he loved most. Nutty Putty Cave was well known in their circle. Its passages had been explored for years, its twists and turns both feared and loved by adventurers. It had a reputation, challenging, sometimes unforgiving, but also exhilarating. To John, it seemed like the perfect way to cap off a holiday week with family. But here's the thing about stories like this. We often look back with the painful knowledge of what's coming. We know the cave will not let him leave. We know that the man who walked in full of life, laughter, and love will never walk out. And yet, before the tragedy, there was only innocence. To John and his brother Josh, it was just another adventure, another crawl through narrow tunnels, another chance to bond. They had no way of knowing that the path John chose that night would not lead him back to the surface. Before the headlines, before the search teams, before the cave became a tomb, John was simply a man. A husband. A father. A son. A brother. A believer. He was the kind of person who loved deeply, who chased curiosity, who made people feel safe in a world that often wasn't. And that's why his story still cuts so deeply, not just because of how he died, but because of how he lived. When the earth closed around him that night, the world didn't just lose a caver. It lost a man who carried within him all the things we hope for in our loved ones. Love, loyalty, faith, and courage. And to understand what happened in Nutty Putty Cave, you first have to remember the man behind the name. To the untrained eye, Nutty Putty Cave looked like nothing more than a scar in the Utah landscape, a quiet opening in the earth, hidden in the rolling hills near Utah Lake. From the outside, it didn't boast the grandeur of the Grand Canyon or the elegance of limestone caverns dripping with stalactites. It was modest, almost unimpressive, a gash in the earth that only whispered of the labyrinth within. Yet for decades, it held a magnetic pull on explorers, thrill-seekers, and weekend adventurers who couldn't resist the temptation of what lay beneath. Nutty Putty wasn't built for comfort. It was no tourist attraction with railings, lights, and guided tours. It was raw earth, a subterranean puzzle of twisting tunnels, sudden drops, and tight squeezes that tested the limits of both body and mind. Its passages didn't invite, they challenged. And that was part of the allure. The cave itself stretched over 1,400 feet, a honeycomb of narrow crawls and chambers carved from clay-rich limestone. Unlike the massive cathedral-like caves you might imagine, Nutty Putty was intimate, claustrophobic even. Many of its passages were so small that only one person could fit through at a time, and often only by lying flat on their stomachs or twisting their shoulders just right. For those who craved adventure, it was irresistible, a test of courage, flexibility, and raw determination. But Nutty Putty was not just a cave, it was a cave with a reputation. Long before John Edward Jones ever set foot inside, Nutty Putty was infamous for its squeezes, passages so tight that even experienced cavers hesitated. Names like the Scout Trap, the Big Slide, the Maze, and most famously, the Birth Canal told the story. These weren't whimsical nicknames, they were warnings. Each label was a reminder of what cavers could expect inside, a trial of endurance, an obstacle designed to push explorers to the edge of panic. The Birth Canal, for example, was one of the most notorious passages. It was exactly what it sounded like. A narrow, twisting tunnel that forced explorers to crawl headfirst through a space that pressed on their ribs and shoulders until finally, mercifully, they were pushed out into a wider chamber. For those who made it, it was exhilarating. For those who didn't, it was terrifying. But while Nutty Putty had its dangers, it also had a history of drawing people back again and again. Scouts, students, church groups, and seasoned cavers all ventured into its depths. Some came for the thrill. Others came for the bonding experience. And some came, like John and his brother Josh, to relive old adventures and reconnect with a place that held memories of their youth. Yet, Nutty Putty's reputation wasn't just built on adventure, it was also built on accidents. By the early 2000s, the cave had already gained a reputation as dangerous ground. Several incidents had made headlines, usually involving inexperienced cavers getting stuck in its tight passages. One of the most notorious spots, the Scout Trap, earned its name after a Boy Scout troop member became lodged inside, sparking a desperate rescue. Fortunately, he survived, but the event cemented the cave's reputation as a place that could easily turn fun into disaster. Between 1999 and 2004, rescuers were called to Nutty Putty Cave at least 6 times for trapped explorers. Each time, they worked in dangerous conditions, crawling into impossibly narrow spaces to pull out terrified cavers. No one had died in the cave before 2009, but the near misses were enough to get people's attention. Officials closed the cave in 2006, citing the mounting dangers. For 3 years, Nutty Putty lay silent, its entrance gated, its tunnels undisturbed. Many assumed it might stay that way forever, a natural hazard best left sealed. But in May 2009, just 6 months before John's ill-fated trip, the cave reopened under new guidelines. Local officials, after consulting with the caving community, decided that with better safety protocols and education, Nutty Putty could once again be accessible. They hoped the cave's dangers could be managed with rules and oversight. The reopening sparked excitement among Utah's adventure seekers. After years of being shut out, the chance to explore Nutty Putty again was too tempting to resist. It wasn't just a cave, it was almost a rite of passage. If you wanted to prove your courage, to feel the thrill of the underground world, you went to Nutty Putty. And so, the cave welcomed a new generation of explorers. To understand why people like John were drawn there, you have to imagine what it felt like to enter. Picture yourself lying flat on the ground, sliding into a dark opening just big enough for your shoulders. Your headlamp is your only light, and the walls press in so tightly you can hear your breath bouncing back at you. Every sound, the scrape of your clothes against rock, the thump of your heartbeat, feels magnified. You crawl forward, the ground damp beneath your palms, the air cooler and thinner. Behind you, the world of light and freedom disappears. Ahead, the unknown waits. For some, that sensation was unbearable, sparking claustrophobia and panic. But for others like John, it was exhilarating. It was stepping into a world untouched by time, where every turn revealed something new, and every challenge tested your willpower. But there was a cruel paradox at play. The very qualities that made Nutty Putty so enticing, the challenge, the tightness, the unknown, were the same ones that made it so deadly. It was a cave that demanded respect, but too often, it received only curiosity. By the fall of 2009, Nutty Putty was once again buzzing with activity. Groups planned trips, friends dared one another to face the birth canal, and families like the Joneses looked forward to sharing the adventure. The cave was no longer just a hole in the ground, it had become a cultural touchstone, a place where stories were born, whether of triumph or of terror. For John Edward Jones, who had grown up in Utah and explored caves in his youth, Nutty Putty was familiar territory. It wasn't just an underground challenge, it was a link to his past. Returning to Utah for Thanksgiving, the idea of exploring Nutty Putty with his brother wasn't reckless. It was nostalgic. It was a way to relive old memories and to make new ones before heading back to the responsibilities of medical school and fatherhood. The cave, of course, had no malice. It didn't lure John inside with sinister intent. It was just there as it had always been, silent, indifferent, unyielding. But like so many before him, John was drawn in by its mystery, its challenge, and its history. What he couldn't know was that this time, Nutty Putty wouldn't let him go. The cave that had drawn in countless explorers with promises of discovery would become the setting of one of the most tragic caving stories of all time. And for John, the adventure that began with laughter and curiosity would end in darkness and silence, deep beneath the Utah soil. The night was crisp and still, the kind of November air that carried a bite sharp enough to remind you winter was closing in. Overhead, stars blanketed the Utah sky, bright against the black canvas, undisturbed by the city lights miles away. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and for most families the hours were spent indoors, surrounded by warmth, food, and chatter. But for John and Josh Jones, the evening held a different kind of tradition, an adventure beneath the earth in a place where few dared to wander. For the Jones brothers, caves had always been more than hollowed earth. They were challenges, puzzles, tests of courage. Growing up, the two had shared countless adventures, scaling rocks, hiking trails, and when they were old enough, crawling through the narrow veins of Utah's underground world. There was something unspoken about their connection, an understanding forged in dirt and sweat, the quiet bond of siblings who didn't need words to know they were in sync. So when John returned home for Thanksgiving in 2009, it was no surprise that one of the outings he planned was a caving trip with Josh. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't spontaneous. It was nostalgia wrapped in brotherhood. One last thrill before the holiday table pulled them back to family gatherings and laughter around the fire. That evening, their group set out for Nutty Putty Cave, flashlights and headlamps in hand, gear packed for the narrow crawl ahead. There was chatter and energy, the kind of electricity that fills the air before an adventure. For John, it was a chance to step outside the pressures of medical school and fatherhood, to slip back into the skin of the boy who once scrambled through caves with nothing but a flashlight and courage. For Josh, it was a chance to share that adventure with his big brother, to laugh and explore like they used to. The cave entrance yawned before them, an unimpressive hole in the hillside, its black mouth waiting patiently. To anyone else it might have looked foreboding, but to the brothers, it was familiar, almost inviting. They crouched down, lamps flickering against the rock, and one by one the group slipped into the earth. Inside, the world changed instantly. The air cooled, damp with the smell of clay and stone. Their lights bounced off slick walls, revealing earthy shades of brown and gray. The sound of their voices echoed strangely, distorted by the narrow passages. It was like stepping into another dimension, where time slowed and every sound seemed magnified. John's laughter echoed first, low and confident. Josh responded with a joke, his voice bouncing through the chamber. Their camaraderie was effortless, born from years of shared adventures. They teased each other about who could squeeze through tighter spaces, who would lead the way, who was braver. Every joke carried warmth, a reminder that beneath the stone and darkness, there was still family. But caves, like time, are indifferent to laughter. The deeper they pressed, the narrower the passages became. To move forward, they had to crawl on hands and knees, sometimes even on their stomachs, elbows digging into clay as they wriggled through. The cave demanded patience and persistence, and the brothers gave it willingly, their headlamps illuminating just a few feet ahead. Beyond that beam of light, there was only darkness, thick and unyielding. At one point, Josh paused, leaning back against the damp wall, his breath visible in the cool air. "Man, it feels like this cave gets smaller every time," he joked, shaking his headlamp to dislodge a smear of clay. John chuckled. "Or maybe you're just getting bigger," he shot back, nudging his younger brother playfully. Their voices filled the silence, bouncing between stone walls. There was no fear in them, no sense of the looming tragedy. To them, it was just another night, another memory being carved into their bond. Still, even in the laughter, there was tension, a kind of underlying hum in the cave that neither brother acknowledged. Perhaps it was instinct, or maybe it was the weight of the earth pressing down. Every caver knows the subtle unease that comes with being underground. The air feels heavier, the walls closer, the silence more absolute. You tell yourself it's safe, that you're in control, but the cave always has the final say. They crawled deeper, pushing past tight squeezes with names that felt more like dares. The scout trap, the big slide, the birth canal. Each passage carried its own reputation, its own stories of explorers who had hesitated, gotten stuck, or turned back. But for the Jones brothers, it was a familiar playground. They pressed forward with confidence, trusting in their experience and in each other. Every so often, John glanced back at Josh, his headlamp beam cutting across his brother's determined face. It was comforting knowing he wasn't alone. They weren't just two men exploring a cave, they were brothers tethered by trust. But the deeper they went, the more unforgiving the cave became. The tunnels narrowed, forcing them into positions that twisted their bodies unnaturally. The clay walls pressed in, slick and unyielding. They had to maneuver carefully, calculating each movement to avoid getting wedged. And yet they laughed. They joked. Because that's what brothers do, they make light of the weight pressing in, of the unknown that lies ahead. For Josh, following John through those passages was more than just an adventure. It was reassurance. John was older, stronger, steadier. If John led the way, everything would be fine. But fate doesn't measure strength or confidence. It doesn't weigh experience or optimism. It waits silently, tucked into the smallest cracks, waiting for the moment when one wrong turn changes everything. As the group moved on, John crawled into a tunnel he believed was the start of the birth canal, one of the most famous squeezes in Nutty Putty. He had done it before and he knew the challenge it posed. He shifted his shoulders, angled his body, and began to slide in headfirst, his lamp cutting a faint path through the darkness. Josh followed close behind, unaware that his brother's decision in that moment would shatter the rhythm of their laughter and transform their adventure into a nightmare. The clay pressed tighter. The tunnel narrowed more than expected. And what John thought was the birth canal was not. It was something else, something far smaller, far more merciless. In the flicker of their headlamps, the brothers' bond, forged in years of adventure, was about to be tested in a way neither could have imagined. The laughter faded. The darkness grew heavier. And the cave, silent and indifferent, prepared to reveal its cruelest twist. The tunnel yawned ahead of him like a dark throat, the clay walls glistening faintly under the pale glow of his headlamp. John Edward Jones hesitated only for a second, steadying his breath. He had done this before. The birth canal, one of Nutty Putty's most notorious squeezes. A tight, nerve-wracking passage, yes, but one he knew he could conquer. He adjusted his body, angling his shoulders just so, then slid forward headfirst, feet pushing against the damp earth behind him. It was supposed to be familiar. It was supposed to be manageable. But it wasn't. The passage was narrower, more constricted than he remembered. His chest scraped against stone, ribs pressing into clay, as his arms tucked tightly to his sides. Each forward movement felt like pushing into the body of the earth itself, like squeezing into a stone coffin. But he kept going. Adventurers know that tight squeezes often feel impossible until you commit, until you wriggle through and burst into the safety of a wider chamber. That was what John told himself. This is just the canal. Keep moving. You've done this before. But a whisper of unease crawled through his mind. Something felt wrong. Behind him, Josh waited, the beam of his headlamp bouncing off John's boots. He could hear his brother's breath, shallow but determined, echoing back through the narrow funnel. Josh couldn't see what John saw, couldn't feel the walls pinching tighter, but he trusted him. John was the older brother, the leader. If John said this was the way, then it was the way. But the tunnel didn't widen. Instead, it pinched, narrowing like the neck of a funnel, sucking John deeper into its chokehold. He shifted, trying to angle his arms upward, but there was no space. His shoulders wedged, pressing hard against the clay walls. His chest compressed, ribs flattening against unforgiving stone. And then came the worst discovery of all. His body was angled downward. He hadn't crawled into a horizontal squeeze. He had slid into a near-vertical shaft, his head lower than his feet, his entire body inverted. Gravity was no longer his ally, it was his executioner, pulling him deeper into the trap. John exhaled sharply, his breath echoing against the walls. He tried to push back, his boots digging into clay, but the tunnel refused to let go. His arms were pinned against his sides, his chest pressed so tightly he could barely expand his lungs. Panic flickered, brief, sharp, electric. He forced it down, reminding himself that panic would only waste oxygen, would only tighten his muscles and make the squeeze worse. But already the reality was setting in. This was not the birth canal. Josh's voice floated down the passage, calm but curious. "You good, John?" John swallowed hard, the movement painful against the pressure on his throat. He tried to sound steady. "Yeah, just a little tighter than I thought. Give me a sec." But seconds passed and John didn't move forward or back. He wriggled, trying to lift his chest, to shift his hips, to angle his body upward, but each motion pressed him tighter. His headlamp flickered across the clay walls, revealing no chamber ahead, no escape route, just more narrowing blackness. His breaths came shorter now, compressed by stone. He angled his face, trying to free his nose and mouth from the earth, and drew in shallow gasps. Upside down, blood rushed toward his head, pounding in his skull. Every heartbeat thudded in his ears like a drum. Josh shifted nervously, calling again. "John? What's going on?" This time John's voice wavered. I think I took the wrong tunnel." The words hung heavy, echoing in the dark, settling into the silence between them. Josh's stomach dropped. He shuffled closer, peering into the narrow funnel, but all he could see was the bottom of John's boots and the small, trapped movements of his legs. "Back up," Josh urged. "Just push out. We'll find another way." "I can't," John whispered, the panic finally bleeding through. "I'm stuck." The clay walls seemed to close in tighter at that admission, the cave itself exhaling a long, indifferent sigh. Josh pressed his hands against John's boots, trying to push upward to reverse the slide. But the angle was wrong, the space too tight. Every push only seemed to wedge John deeper, gravity pulling his weight downward like an anchor. Inside the tunnel, John's world shrank. His arms were pinned like they had been lashed to his sides. His chest, bent and crushed, made breathing a conscious effort. Each inhale was shallow, fragile. Each exhale echoed against stone. His body, inverted, strained against the unnatural position, organs pressing against his diaphragm, blood pooling dangerously in his brain. He tried to stay calm, but claustrophobia gnawed at his mind. He was trapped, really trapped. Time warped in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. John focused on Josh's voice, the calm anchor above the panic. His brother was there. He wasn't alone. As long as Josh was there, there was hope. But Josh felt the tremors of dread building in his chest. He knew this was no ordinary stuck. He had seen cavers squeeze through impossible gaps, watched them backtrack with effort, but this was different. John wasn't wedged in a passage. He was swallowed by it, gripped by a tunnel that tightened with every breath. Josh pulled back, his heart pounding. He scrambled out of the tight corridor, the cool air of the wider chamber hitting his face like a slap. His breaths came ragged, sharp, but his mind was already racing. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. "Hang on, John. I'm going for help," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cave. Back in the suffocating tunnel, John closed his eyes. The earth pressed against him on all sides, and for the first time, he felt the creeping edge of fear he couldn't push away. The cave didn't care who he was or that he was a husband, a father-to-be, a medical student with a future waiting above ground. It only cared that he had made a mistake. And mistakes in Nutty Putty Cave carried no mercy. Alone in the dark, upside down, pinned in a space not much bigger than his body, John understood the cruel truth. The cave had him, and it wasn't going to let go easily. Josh's voice cracked as it echoed through the blackened stone corridors. "John, talk to me." Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint, strangled sound of his brother's breath. John's voice came back, muffled, weak, no longer the confident tone of the big brother who always led the way. "I can't breathe, Josh." The words, thin and broken, cut through Josh like shards of glass. Panic clawed at him. His hands, dirty and scraped, fumbled against the cave walls as he backed out of the tight passage, scrambling on elbows and knees, his heart pounding harder with every movement. The world around him felt suddenly hostile. The cave wasn't a playground of adventure anymore. It was a predator, and it had swallowed his brother whole. Josh's lamp beam flickered wildly across the walls as he crawled, emerging into a slightly wider chamber where he could finally stand, gasping for breath. The air felt stale, damp, but compared to the suffocating squeeze John was trapped in, it might as well have been freedom itself. His chest heaved. His thoughts spiraled. "I need help. No," he shouted, his voice ricocheting through the cave's network of tunnels, hoping someone in their group of friends had stayed close enough to hear. His calls tore through the darkness, raw and frantic. "Help. You stuck." John stuck bad. Within minutes, footsteps echoed back, quick, uneven. Their friends appeared, their lamps slicing through the dark. Faces wide-eyed, breaths ragged, they surrounded Josh, bombarding him with questions. What happened? Is he hurt? Can he get out? Josh shook his head, dirt streaking his face, his eyes glistening with a sheen of fear he couldn't hide. "No, he's upside down. He's stuck tight. He can't breathe right. We need rescuers. We can't do this alone." The words were final, heavy. Everyone felt it. This wasn't a scrape-your-elbows kind of stuck. This was something darker. One of them, trembling, pulled out a phone. The call went through to Utah County authorities. The message was short but urgent. "A man is trapped inside Nutty Putty Cave. He can't get out." The response began almost immediately. By the time Josh stumbled out of the cave's narrow mouth into the cold Utah night, shivering and pale, the first flash of red and blue lights was already cutting across the sagebrush. The sirens wailed against the still night, echoing across the flatlands. Vehicles pulled up in a rush, trucks, SUVs and ambulance, sliding to halts on the dusty ground. Rescue personnel spilled out, boots crunching against the earth, carrying gear. Ropes coiled tight, drills heavy in hand, duffel bags of medical supplies slung over shoulders. They moved quickly, with a kind of urgent precision, their faces already carved with focus. Josh, dirt-streaked and wide-eyed, ran toward them. His voice cracked as he explained. "My brother, he's stuck. Deep in there. About 400 feet. Upside down. He can't move. He can't breathe right." The rescuers exchanged grim looks. They had heard of Nutty Putty Cave before. Some had trained in it. A few had even feared something like this might happen. But now it wasn't theory, it was real, and time was their enemy. One rescuer, older, calm but firm, placed a hand on Josh's shoulder. "Stay with us. We'll get him out. Just tell us everything." Josh pointed toward the dark opening, his hand trembling. "It's down that way. Past the first squeeze. Take the left at the fork. You'll hear him." And with that, the rescue began. The first team entered, helmets strapped, headlamps blazing, gear rattling against their belts. The cave swallowed them quickly, their lights bobbing like fireflies disappearing into a black sea. Inside, the air was thick, pressing in with silence. The rescuers crawled, ducked, slid on their bellies, their gear scraping against rock. Each foot forward felt slower than it should, the weight of urgency dragging them. Somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the gasping voice of John. "Help here." It was barely more than a whisper, but it lit a fire under them. When they reached the vertical funnel, the sight stole their breath. John's body was wedged upside down, only his boots and lower legs visible, twitching in small, strained motions. The tunnel held him like a fist. "John, my name is Tom," one rescuer called gently, pressing close to the narrow shaft. His voice was steady, calm. "We're here now. You're going to be okay. We're going to get you out." A muffled reply drifted back, strained and broken. "Can't breathe." Tom pressed his helmet against the stone, speaking as close as he could. "I need you to stay with me. Just keep talking. We've got ropes, pulleys, we'll pull you free." They wasted no time. Gear clattered against stone as the team began anchoring ropes, drilling bolts into rock walls, setting up a pulley system strong enough to drag a man out of the earth itself. Every movement was deliberate, every knot tied with precision. This was more than rescue, it was war against the cave itself. But the cave fought back. The angles were brutal. The walls pressed in tight, leaving no room to maneuver tools. The rope system groaned under the strain. Every pull shifted John's body only a fraction before gravity dragged him back. The rescuers gritted their teeth, sweat dripping down their faces, the strain of effort carving lines into their expressions. Above ground, more vehicles arrived. News spread fast. Families of the trapped man gathered, their faces pale with dread. The night air buzzed with radios, orders, and the heavy silence of people praying under their breath. Inside the cave, time was slipping. John's breaths grew shorter, each one rattling with exhaustion. The upside-down position was draining him, blood rushing to his head, lungs struggling against the weight of his own body. Josh crawled close again, refusing to leave, his hand pressing against his brother's boot. "I'm right here, John. You're not alone. Just hold on." In the narrow shaft, John's voice trembled. "Don't leave me." "I won't," Josh promised, his voice cracking. "Not ever." The rescuers worked with frantic focus. Rope systems tightened. Drills echoed. Commands bounced off stone walls. And through it all, the cave remained indifferent, its cold clay walls unmoved by human desperation. The race had begun. A race not only against time but against the crushing silence of the earth itself. And as the hours stretched into the night, one truth settled heavy over everyone there. Nutty Putty Cave had claimed a man, and it was not going to give him back easily. The mouth of Nutty Putty Cave had transformed into a battlefield. Floodlights bathed the barren Utah landscape in harsh white, generators hummed like restless beasts, and rescue vehicles ringed the site with their engines idling low. Radios crackled, boots stomped over hard dirt, and the air vibrated with a single unspoken truth: time was bleeding away second by second. By midnight, more than 100 rescuers had swarmed the site. Firefighters, paramedics, search and rescue specialists, even engineers. Some were veterans of cave rescues, men and women who had trained for exactly this scenario. Others were volunteers, adrenaline and compassion driving them into the night. All of them converged on one goal: pull John Edward Jones back to the surface alive. Inside the cave, the scene was claustrophobic chaos. Helmets clinked against stone. Ropes snaked along the damp clay floor. Drills screamed as bolts were hammered into unforgiving rock, sparks flashing in the gloom. The rescuers moved like a machine, sweating, cursing, shouting commands that ricocheted off walls slick with condensation. "Anchor here. Secure the pulley. Ropes tight, give me slack on 3. They built their system piece by piece, anchoring steel bolts into the cave's ribs, threading rope through carabiners and fixing pulleys at precise angles. It was an engineering puzzle inside a tomb. There was no room for error. One weak anchor, one miscalculated angle, and the system would fail. John, wedged upside down in the earth's throat, felt every vibration, every metallic clank. He couldn't see them. His headlamp was buried against the clay, but he could hear them. The voices, the urgency, the mechanical screech of drills. It was hope, tangible and close. But his body was betraying him. Pinned at a brutal angle, his torso bent backward, every inch upward brought agony. Blood pounded in his skull, swelling the veins in his temples. His vision blurred. His lungs, compressed by stone and gravity, fought for air in shallow gasps. The pain wasn't just physical. It was consuming, spreading from his chest to his mind like wildfire. Still he tried to stay calm. He prayed silently, his lips moving in whispers. He thought of Emily, his wife, 7 months pregnant. He thought of the daughter he hadn't yet met. He thought of Thanksgiving dinner, waiting at his parents' home. He clung to those thoughts like lifelines in the dark. Then came the first pull. The rope system groaned as rescuers outside the shaft leaned back with their weight, heaving with all their strength. The pulley creaked, rope fibers straining. John's body shifted upward by inches, small, painful inches. His breath hitched, a sharp cry tearing from his throat. "Easy, easy," one rescuer shouted. "He's moving." The team froze, waiting for John's response. His voice, muffled and broken, floated back. "Hurts, can't breathe." They eased the tension, adjusting the angle. Sweat dripped down their brows, their muscles trembling from the effort. This was no simple lift. They were trying to haul dead weight from a vertical coffin, fighting gravity, friction, and the merciless grip of the cave. Hour after hour, the machine of rescue ground on. Teams rotated, some drilling fresh anchor points, others reinforcing knots, while medics waited just out of reach, ready with oxygen tanks and 4 bags. The cave echoed with their determination, with the grunts of exertion and the relentless squeal of rope under strain. Josh stayed close, never leaving. His hand rested against his brother's boot whenever he could squeeze near the shaft. His voice was hoarse from calling encouragement. "You're not alone, John. We're here. Just hang on. Think of Emily. Think of the baby." John answered in ragged bursts, each word costing him precious air. "Tell her? I love her." The rescuers exchanged grim glances but said nothing. They couldn't allow despair. Not yet. As dawn neared, exhaustion crept in. Rescuers' arms trembled with fatigue. Their clothes were soaked with sweat and smeared with clay. Still they worked. Every inch they gained was a small victory, even if John screamed in pain. His suffering fueled them, it meant he was still alive. But the cave fought harder. The shaft's angle pressed his torso backward, his spine bending unnaturally. His ribcage crushed tighter with every attempt to lift him. And all the while, gravity dragged him deeper, undoing progress in cruel increments. Above ground, the scene was equally tense. Reporters gathered at the perimeter, their cameras flashing in the cold morning light. Family members huddled together, clutching blankets, faces pale with fear and sleeplessness. Emily sat silently, her hands folded over her swollen belly, eyes fixed on the cave entrance as if sheer willpower could drag her husband free. Back underground, the rescue machine groaned through the morning hours. At one point, cheers erupted when John was lifted nearly a foot higher. Medics scrambled forward, calling encouragement, readying gear. But then, a sharp snap. The cave filled with a gut-wrenching sound, metal shearing, rope whipping. A pulley anchor ripped loose from the wall, the system jolting violently. Rescuers shouted in alarm, bracing themselves as the ropes went slack. John slid back down, his cry of pain echoing in the stone chamber. "No, no, no!" Josh screamed, pounding his fists against the clay. The rescuers froze, shock written on their faces. The system had failed. Hours of progress undone in seconds. The silence that followed was suffocating. John's voice came again, weaker now, barely more than a whisper. "Please, don't stop." No one dared suggest stopping. Not yet. They regrouped, redrilled anchors, recalculated angles. But a terrible truth was beginning to sink in, unspoken but heavy in the air. Time was running out and the cave was winning. Above ground, the sun climbed high over Utah, casting harsh light on a rescue that felt increasingly hopeless. News vans broadcast live updates. Strangers prayed in living rooms miles away. The world was beginning to watch. But inside Nutty Putty, there was only the machine of rescue, sweating, bleeding, straining against the earth itself. And at its center, John Edward Jones, still alive, still fighting but slipping ever closer to the edge. The cave was alive with noise. The grinding of drills. The rasp of ropes. The grunts of rescuers pulling with everything they had left. It was a symphony of desperation, echoing through the stone like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. And at the center of it all, John Edward Jones. Pinned, bent, inverted, blood flooding his head, chest squeezed until every breath was a battle. He was the fragile core of this relentless effort. Yet even in that broken position, he had clung to hope. Inch by inch, the rescuers had lifted him. His boots had shifted higher, his torso had freed slightly, and for the first time in more than 20 hours, the whispers of escape seemed possible. Josh held his brother's foot, whispering encouragement. "Almost there, John. Just a little more. Stay with me." John's voice, cracked and faint, drifted up the shaft. "Don't let go." "We won't," Josh swore, his voice trembling. The rescuers heaved again. Ropes groaned under the weight, pulleys squealed as steel bit against stone. Dust trickled down in tiny rivulets, falling like sand through an hourglass. The machine was working. Slowly. Painfully. But it was working. And then disaster. The sound came like a gunshot in the dark, a metallic crack that tore through the chamber. One of the pulleys snapped free from its anchor, the bolt ripped straight out of the cave wall. The rope recoiled, whipping through the shaft. Rescuers shouted, ducking instinctively, helmets clashing against stone. The system lurched, its delicate balance destroyed. And John slid back. The cave swallowed him like a predator reclaiming its prey. He dropped into the same tomb-like angle he had started in, his body folding under the pressure, his head forced lower, his lungs flattened once again. His scream echoed once, sharp and guttural, then dissolved into a broken gasp. "No!" Josh's cry tore through the chamber. He clawed toward his brother as if raw desperation could fight physics, but hands dragged him back. The rescuers knew, another lunge could dislodge even more of the system, could cost more lives. The silence that followed was crushing. Only John's ragged breathing filled the space, weak, uneven. Each gasp was a thread fraying fast. Hours of work, gone in seconds. Above ground, the news spread quickly. Radios crackled with the words no one wanted to hear. System failure. A ripple of despair swept across the crowd gathered near the cave's entrance. Family members clutched one another tighter. Emily, her hands pressed against her swollen belly, closed her eyes as if she could will the sound away. She whispered a prayer, lips trembling. Reporters lowered their microphones, unsure how to capture the shift from hope to horror. The floodlights that bathed the scene seemed suddenly too harsh, illuminating faces etched with dread. Back underground, the rescuers regrouped, but exhaustion clung to them like chains. They had been at it for over a day, their muscles sore, their throats raw from shouting commands. Their eyes were red, their minds clouded by the gnawing weight of failure. But they couldn't quit. They drilled new anchors, hammered new bolts, reset pulleys with trembling hands. The cave floor was littered with broken metal and frayed rope, a battlefield scarred by their war with stone. Still they fought. But John was fading. His body had endured too much. Upside down for nearly a full day, blood continued to pool in his brain, swelling pressure behind his eyes, distorting his vision into blurs and flashes. His lungs begged for air, his diaphragm fighting the unnatural compression. His mouth was dry, his skin clammy. He drifted in and out of lucidity, caught between pain and delirium. When Josh's voice reached him, steady, pleading, desperate, John tried to respond but the words slurred. "So tired. Don't you close your eyes." Josh snapped, his own voice cracking. "Stay with me, John. Stay awake. Emily needs you. The baby needs you." A faint chuckle bubbled up from John, weak but heartbreaking. "Tell her? I love her." Tears blurred Josh's vision. He pressed his forehead against the stone, helpless. He could hear the rescuers straining again, their voices low, focused, but in his gut he felt the truth. John was slipping, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop the tide. The hours stretched cruelly. Rescuers rotated out, faces pale, hands blistered, bodies trembling from exhaustion. Fresh ones took their place, fueled by urgency, but the cave was merciless. The tighter they pulled, the more John's body protested. Each effort was agony for him, his groans echoing like ghosts through the chamber. A medic crawled close, his voice calm, clinical. "We're doing everything we can. Just hold on. We'll get you oxygen. Just breathe." But oxygen couldn't fix what gravity was doing to him. It couldn't reverse the blood pooling, the organs straining, the crushing weight of stone. It was becoming clearer with every minute. John's body was reaching its breaking point. Above, the morning sun had climbed high. Reporters delivered grim updates live, their voices subdued. Strangers across the state tuned in, praying, waiting, dreading. Nutty Putty Cave, once just a strange landmark, had become a headline. Man trapped underground. Rescue in progress. And at the site itself, silence hung heavy, broken only by the hum of generators and the occasional sob from the crowd. Inside, Josh squeezed his brother's foot one last time. "We're not giving up, John. I promise. You'll see the sky again. Just hang on." John's reply was soft, barely audible, but it lingered in the chamber like a plea. "Don't let go." The rescuers pulled again. The rope screamed. The anchors groaned. Sweat poured. But hope, once burning bright, now flickered weakly, like a candle fighting against a storm. And in that moment, everyone knew. They were no longer racing the cave. They were racing time itself. The breaking point had come. And no one knew if John had the strength left to survive it. The morning sky above Nutty Putty was bright and mercilessly clear, the kind of Utah blue that usually promised warmth and safety. But around the cave's entrance, where floodlights still blazed and generators hummed, it felt cruelly out of place. Here the air was heavy with dread. Emily Jones sat wrapped in a blanket, her hands resting on the swell of her belly. 7 months pregnant, she looked like she should have been anywhere else. At home, safe, surrounded by family. Instead, she was here, watching, waiting, her eyes locked on the black mouth of the cave that had swallowed her husband. Every shout from a rescuer, every whisper among officials, made her chest tighten. She had been calm at first, holding on to the reassurances that John was strong, that rescuers were skilled, that this nightmare would end with him walking out covered in mud but alive. But now, nearly 24 hours later, hope was cracking. The rescuers who emerged from the cave no longer looked confident. Their shoulders sagged. Their helmets hung low. They whispered more than they spoke. Beside her, John's parents knelt in prayer. His father's voice trembled as he pleaded with God for strength, for mercy, for a miracle. His mother's hands shook, clutching a rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palms. Around them, siblings huddled together, some weeping openly, others staring in stunned silence at the barren horizon. Reporters lingered nearby, cameras lowered out of respect, yet recording nonetheless. Their voices, when they gave updates, were subdued, as if the entire nation watching on live broadcasts could feel the fragile line between life and death unraveling in real time. Inside the cave, grim updates crackled over radios. Vitals dropping. Respiration shallow. He's fading fast. The rescuers spoke in clipped tones, but the weight behind their words carried up to the surface. Family members heard the fragments, enough to understand the truth. Emily closed her eyes, her hand pressing against her stomach. She whispered to her unborn child, her words breaking with every breath. "Daddy's fighting. He's trying to come back to us." But deep inside, a part of her feared the words were more for herself than for the baby. As the hours stretched into afternoon, officials rotated in and out, briefing the family as gently as they could. Each time the news worsened. "We've lifted him a few inches, but his body is under extreme strain. The pulley system failed. We're resetting, but it's slow. He's still responsive, but his strength is slipping." Emily listened, nodding numbly, her heart breaking with each update. She wanted to scream, to demand they pull him out no matter the cost. But she knew in her gut, that the rescuers were already pushing themselves past human limits. Josh, still coated in clay and sweat, finally emerged from the cave, collapsing onto the dirt near his family. His eyes were red, his hands scraped raw. When he saw Emily, he shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I tried him. I stayed with him. He kept saying he loves you. He was praying for you and the baby." Emily reached for him, pulling him into a trembling embrace. She pressed her face against his shoulder, sobbing quietly. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what she had been fighting against all night. The possibility that John wasn't coming back. Rescuers inside kept working, but exhaustion showed in every movement. Their arms ached, their eyes burned from the dust, and their minds carried the unbearable weight of a man's life slipping through their fingers. They had trained for disasters, but no training could prepare them for watching hope drain hour by hour, watching a family crumble above ground as their loved one gasped below. At one point, a medic pressed his ear to the stone, straining to catch John's voice. The words were slurred, barely audible. "Tell Emily, I love her." The medic swallowed hard, his throat tight. He relayed the message up the shaft, and within minutes it reached the surface. When Emily heard it, she pressed both hands against her belly and broke down completely, sobbing until her body shook. His words were a gift, and a goodbye. By late afternoon, the site was cloaked in a quiet dread. The crowd of rescuers had grown stiller, the chatter replaced by silence. The hum of generators filled the void. Above the cave, the family huddled in prayer circles, some kneeling in the dust, others rocking gently with grief they couldn't yet name. Emily sat alone for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in gold and crimson, as if mocking the darkness growing inside her. She thought of John's smile, of the way he had placed his ear against her stomach to listen to their baby's heartbeat. She thought of the plans they had made, the home they were building, the future that seemed so certain just days ago. Now all of it hung by a thread, buried under hundreds of feet of unforgiving earth. As darkness fell once more, officials approached the family. Their faces were pale, their voices solemn. "We're doing everything we can. But the conditions are worsening. His body, he's reaching a point where even if we free him, he may not survive the trauma." The words landed like stones. Some of John's siblings broke into sobs. His parents clutched each other tighter, whispering prayers through tears. And Emily, her back straight, her hands folded over her stomach, sat in silence. Her tears had dried, but her face was hollow, as though she had aged years in a single day. She whispered only one sentence, her voice almost inaudible. "Please don't let him die alone." Inside, Josh's words still lingered in John's ears, though faintly, like echoes from another world. He was drifting in and out now, trapped between consciousness and surrender. The cave pressed tighter, the blood roared louder in his head, and the pain dulled into a heavy, suffocating numbness. He prayed again, his lips forming silent words, clinging to the only light he could find in the suffocating dark, faith that he would see Emily and his children again, whether in this life or the next. And as the rescuers fought on, as his family wept above, Nutty Putty Cave tightened its grip, forcing everyone, above and below ground, to face the truth they had been avoiding. The final hours had begun. The cave was unnervingly quiet. For nearly 28 hours, the walls had echoed with commands, with drills, with grunts of effort and clipped updates over radios. But now, as the night deepened and the cold crept in, silence settled like a shroud. The rescuers who remained underground moved slower, their shoulders heavy with fatigue, their eyes shadowed with defeat. They weren't just fighting stone anymore, they were fighting time, and time was winning. John Edward Jones still hung upside down in the jagged funnel of limestone, his body contorted into a position no human form was meant to endure. His head was lower than his heart, blood flooding his brain, organs straining under relentless pressure. Each breath he took was a ragged battle. His lips were pale, his skin clammy, and his once steady voice now came only in weak fragments. "Light," he whispered hoarsely, the word nearly swallowed by the cave's throat. A rescuer leaned closer, shining his headlamp gently toward John's face. The glow illuminated the mud smeared across his forehead, the fatigue carved into every line. "Stay with us, John. We're right here," the rescuer murmured, his voice steady though his heart was breaking. He knew the truth, they all did, but none of them were ready to say it aloud. Above ground, the family clung to every update crackling through the radios. Emily, wrapped in her blanket, her swollen belly rising and falling with her own anxious breaths, lifted her head every time she heard John's name. "He's asking for light," one rescuer relayed. Emily's eyes filled instantly. "He's scared of the dark," she whispered. She remembered countless nights when John, lying beside her, would tease about how caves were beautiful but merciless, places where darkness could swallow even the strongest man. And now that darkness was all around him. She pressed her hand against her stomach. "He just wants to see something, anything before?" Her voice broke before she could finish. Inside, medics checked his vitals, their hands trembling as they searched for strength where there was almost none left. His pulse was thin, erratic, slipping like water through their fingers. One medic adjusted the monitor clipped awkwardly to his body, but the numbers on the screen told the story plainly. His time was nearly over. "John," another rescuer said softly, crouching as close as he could to the narrow crevice. "Your family's here. They love you. You're not alone." John blinked slowly as if dragging his eyelids open cost him everything. "Emily," he breathed, his lips barely forming the name. The rescuer nodded, swallowing hard. "She's right outside. She knows you love her." John gave the faintest of smiles, though it was more shadow than expression. His eyes, once full of life and mischief, now fluttered between the world he knew and the one pulling him away. The team made one last attempt, strapping in the ropes, tightening the system, hoping against hope they could lift him free before his body surrendered. They heaved, grunting with the effort, pulling every ounce of strength left in their exhausted arms. The rope strained, stone groaned, and John's body rose only a fraction before slumping back into its cruel trap. He cried out weakly, a sound that pierced the men's hearts. Pain lanced through him with every tug. "No more," he whispered. "Please, no more." The rescuers froze, the weight of his plea pressing heavier than the rock around them. They exchanged glances, silent agreement in their eyes. To pull again would mean breaking him before freeing him. And so, with hearts shattering, they eased back, hands trembling as they set the rope down. By now, John's breaths were shallow, rasping. His words became scattered fragments, slipping like leaves caught in a current. "Tell Emily, love. Baby. Pray." One rescuer knelt as close as the passage allowed, his helmet scraping stone, and placed a hand against John's shoulder, an anchor in the suffocating dark. "We'll tell her everything," he promised. "She knows. She feels it." John's eyes closed, then fluttered open one last time. He gazed upward, toward the faint halo of the headlamp above him. The cave pressed closer, stone against bone, but for that fleeting second he wasn't looking at rock. He was searching for sky, for stars, for the faces of the people he loved. At 11:56 p.m., his body gave its final protest. His heart, strained beyond repair, stuttered and stopped. The monitor beeped once, flatlined, and then there was only silence. The rescuers bowed their heads. Some wept openly, their tears streaking through mud. Others sat back against the stone, helmets in their hands, unable to move. In that hollowed chamber of earth, they had fought for more than a day, but the cave had claimed him all the same. Above ground, the message traveled fast and heavy. An official approached Emily, his face pale, his eyes red. He crouched in front of her, words choking in his throat. She knew before he spoke. A wife always knows. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, please not John." The official's voice broke as he said the words no one ever wanted to hear. "I'm so sorry. He's gone." The world around her collapsed. A wail tore from her chest, primal and raw, echoing into the night sky. She clutched her belly, rocking forward, sobbing so violently she could hardly breathe. John's parents crumpled to the ground beside her, their cries mixing with hers, their faith battered against the merciless reality. His siblings held one another, their faces buried in each other's shoulders. The cave entrance, silent and dark, became a tomb. The rescuers who emerged later looked like ghosts. Their eyes were hollow, their faces streaked with mud and grief. Some of them had children at home, wives waiting for them. They had gone into the earth determined to save a man, and instead, they had borne witness to his final breath. They carried with them his last words, his final prayers, and the unbearable truth that sometimes, even the strongest hands cannot pull a man back from the grip of stone. Emily sat in the dirt long after the officials urged her to rest. She gazed into the darkness of the cave, whispering through tears, "He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone." She wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, that in his last moment, John felt her love, their family's prayers, and the light they tried to give him in the dark. But as the night grew colder and the stars stretched endlessly above, the silence of Nutty Putty swallowed every sound. John Edward Jones, husband, father, brother, son, was gone. And the cave, indifferent and eternal, kept its hold. The hours after John's heart stopped were cloaked in a silence heavier than stone. The radios that had carried urgent commands and desperate updates went quiet. The floodlights around Nutty Putty's entrance hummed against the night air, casting long shadows over exhausted rescuers whose faces carried the look of soldiers returning from a lost war. Deep underground, his body remained wedged in the stone funnel, motionless, surrounded by men who had given everything to pull him free. Some still crouched in place, helmets lowered, hands resting against the cold rock as if unwilling to let go. Others sat back against the walls, their tears mixing with the mud streaked across their faces. No one wanted to leave him there, not after fighting beside him for so long, not after hearing his final words. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a grim reality settled over the rescue team. John was gone, and retrieving his body would be far more dangerous than saving him had ever been. Above ground, Emily clutched a blanket tightly around her shoulders, her eyes swollen from crying. She hadn't moved since hearing the words. Her family circled close, forming a cocoon of prayer and grief. The world beyond the cave seemed distant, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was the impossible question. What would happen to John? Rescue officials gathered in a makeshift tent, their voices hushed but grave. Charts of the cave sprawled across the table, diagrams of the rope system scribbled with notes, but the conclusion was unavoidable. To extract John now would mean sending more men into a death trap. He's positioned head down, completely wedged, one engineer explained, his voice flat with exhaustion. Any attempt to dislodge him without his cooperation risks collapse. And with his body limp, the physics work against us. Another rescuer rubbed his forehead, staring at the ground. We nearly lost people just trying to keep him alive. Going back in now for recovery could cost us more lives. It's too unstable. The silence that followed was suffocating. They all knew what those words meant, leaving him behind. When the officials stepped out to speak to the family, the air around the cave shifted. Emily's eyes snapped to their faces, searching for hope, for some sliver of possibility. But their expressions told her everything before they spoke. Her father-in-law straightened, his voice quivering as he asked, "You're saying, you won't bring him out?" The lead official swallowed hard. "We're saying that to attempt it would put more lives at risk. The structure around him is fragile. We can't safely get him free." Emily felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow. Her mind rebelled against the words. Leave him there? In the cold dark? Buried alive by stone? The thought tore at her heart. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't leave him. He's my husband. He's the father of my children. He belongs with us, not in there." The official's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. We've tried everything. If we could bring him out safely, we would. But we can't." The family broke down, their grief spilling out in wails that echoed into the desert night. Some clutched each other, others collapsed onto the ground. Emily pressed both hands against her belly, rocking forward as tears streamed down her face. She whispered John's name over and over, as though saying it could anchor him back to her. In the end, after hours of anguished discussion, prayer and sobbing, the family faced the cruelest decision of all. To protect the lives of others, to prevent more tragedy, John would remain where he had fallen. The cave that had trapped him would now be his grave. When the decision was announced, rescuers bowed their heads in silence. Some of them had trained for decades, but nothing in their careers had prepared them for this moment. To walk away from a man they had sworn to save felt like betrayal. Yet they knew it was mercy too, mercy for the living who might otherwise join him in the stone. One veteran rescuer whispered, "We came to bring him out. Now, we leave him in God's hands." The days that followed were filled with rituals of grief. The cave's entrance was sealed with concrete, explosives collapsing the dangerous passage where John remained. Nutty Putty, once a playground for adventurers, was transformed into a tomb, its dark corridors forever off-limits. For Emily and the Jones family, the closure was both unbearable and necessary. They gathered at the site, placing flowers near the sealed entrance, whispering prayers into the wind. Though no gravestone marked his resting place, they knew he was there, beneath their feet, in the belly of the earth. Emily, her hand resting on her unborn child, whispered softly through tears, "He'll know where his daddy rests. He'll know the man who loved him even if he never saw his face." News of the tragedy spread far beyond Utah. Across the country, people watched in sorrow as details emerged. The failed pulley system, the impossible angles, the family's decision. To many, Nutty Putty became more than just a cave. It became a symbol of fragility, of how quickly adventure can turn to loss. But for those who had been there, for Emily, for Josh, for the rescuers who carried John's last words, the story was not about the cave. It was about a man, a husband who spoke of love with his final breath, a father who never stopped fighting, a son whose family prayed until the end. On the last night before leaving the site, one rescuer lingered by the sealed entrance. He placed his hand on the cold concrete, whispering, "Rest easy, John. We did all we could." Then he turned away, walking into the desert darkness, the hum of the generators finally silent, the cave behind him now eternal. Nutty Putty Cave was no longer a place for explorers. It was a grave, a memorial, and a reminder. John Edward Jones remained inside, not just in body but in story. And that story would be told for generations as both warning and tribute. The impossible choice had been made. And in the shadow of that choice, the world wept. The desert morning came quietly, the horizon painted in soft strokes of pink and gold. But at the mouth of Nutty Putty Cave, there was no sense of beauty, no awe at the sunrise. The ground was scarred with tire tracks, equipment scattered like the remnants of a battle. And in many ways it was won. A battle had been fought here, against stone, against time, against mortality itself. And the cave had won. Authorities gathered in hushed clusters, their faces grim with the weight of what was about to happen. Engineers checked detonators. Workers unspooled cables. A stack of sandbags stood nearby, ready to absorb the blast. The decision had been made in the darkest hours after John's death. Nutty Putty Cave would never again swallow another life. The cave's entrance yawned open, black and indifferent. To those who had descended into its depths, it looked like the mouth of a beast, silent now but once ravenous. And like any beast that claimed blood, it had to be put down. Emily stood with John's parents a short distance away, a blanket around her shoulders though the desert air had already begun to warm. She hadn't slept in days, her eyes red, her face pale. Her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, the baby inside a living piece of John that would carry his legacy forward. She stared at the opening, the place where her husband still lay. Though she understood the logic, the necessity, the thought of sealing it made her chest ache. It felt like burying him twice. John's father squeezed her shoulder gently. "This is his resting place now. We'll honor it." His voice trembled, but there was resolve in his eyes. Emily nodded faintly, though her lips pressed tight as if holding back words she dared not say. At a signal, the crew moved into position. Explosives had been carefully set in the fragile passageways, not to obliterate the cave entirely, but to collapse the sections leading to John's body, cutting off any future path. The entrance itself would be entombed in concrete, a permanent barrier. When the countdown began, A hush fell over the crowd of rescuers, family, and officials. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as if the desert itself had gone still. 3, 2, 1. A muffled thunder rumbled from beneath the earth, the ground trembling underfoot. Dust plumed from the cave's mouth, spilling outward before settling in the morning air. The blast echoed across the barren landscape, a grim punctuation marked to days of anguish. When the sound faded, silence returned, heavier, more final than before. The beast had been silenced. Workers moved quickly to finish the task. Concrete trucks arrived, backing into place with low groans. Thick gray slurry poured into the once open mouth of Nutty Putty, spreading into cracks, filling the void where countless adventurers had once crawled with laughter and courage. As the concrete hardened, it transformed the entrance from a passageway into a tomb. What had once been an invitation to explore now became a wall, a gravestone carved by human hands. Some rescuers stood with helmets in hand, heads bowed. They had fought harder than anyone, and yet this was the ending none of them had wanted. To see the cave sealed was to admit defeat, but it was also to protect others. And that was something John himself, a man of faith and family, would have wanted. The Jones family held a quiet vigil as the work continued. John's mother clutched a Bible, reading aloud through tears. His siblings placed flowers near the site, their petals stark against the pale desert soil. Emily whispered prayers, her voice so faint the wind nearly carried it away. "He's not just in there," she said softly, her hand pressed over her heart. "He's with us. Always." Still, as the final layer of concrete sealed the cave, tears streamed down her face. It felt unnatural, unjust, to leave him behind in darkness. But she also knew, this was not where his soul remained. This was only stone, only earth. John's spirit had already gone where the cave could not follow. When the work was complete, officials stepped back. Nutty Putty was gone, not erased but transformed. No adventurer would ever crawl through its narrow tunnels again. No laughter would echo off its limestone walls. It stood now as a memorial, not a playground. News of the closure spread across the nation. Some cavers mourned the loss of a beloved challenge, but most understood. Nutty Putty had taken enough. The decision to seal it was an act of mercy, a line drawn between thrill and tragedy. In time, the site became more than just a sealed cave. It became a story carried in whispers and headlines, a warning passed down to those who sought adventure beneath the earth. And at its heart was John Edward Jones, a young father whose final struggle left an imprint deeper than any tunnel ever carved. Months later, when Emily held her newborn son in her arms, she thought of John. She thought of his smile, his laughter, the way he had pressed his ear to her belly to listen for their baby's heartbeat. She named the child with care, ensuring that every time his name was spoken, a part of John's spirit was remembered. As her children grew, she would bring them here one day, not to grieve but to understand. To see where their father rested, to know his courage, to feel the weight of his story etched into the desert stone. Because Nutty Putty Cave was no longer just a cave. It was a monument to love, to sacrifice, and to the fragile line between life and death. One rescuer returned years later, long after the dust had settled and the site had grown quiet. He stood at the concrete face, brushing away the desert sand that clung to its surface. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We remember you, John." The wind carried his words into the horizon. And beneath their feet, in the sealed earth, the story of John Edward Jones remained, forever preserved in stone, forever guarded by the silence of the cave that would never again open its jaws. Nutty Putty had been sealed. But John's legacy lived on. The desert wind still whispered across the sealed face of Nutty Putty Cave, carrying with it echoes of laughter, prayers, and grief. For most, the site had become a story, a headline, a warning etched into the annals of caving history. But for those who loved John Edward Jones, it was more than that. It was sacred ground, the final chapter of a life too brief, yet impossibly full. His death reverberated far beyond Utah. Across the caving community, it became a story retold in hushed tones before expeditions, a sobering reminder that beneath the earth's beauty lay danger merciless and absolute. Experienced spelunkers spoke of John not as a foolhardy thrill-seeker, but as a symbol of how even the most careful, faithful, and loving among us can be caught in nature's unforgiving grip. His tragedy rewrote the unspoken rules, that caves were not playgrounds, that adventure carried weight, that respect for the earth's depths was not optional but essential. But to Emily, to Josh, to his parents, and to the child who would never see his father's smile, John's story was not just about caution. It was about love. At home, framed photographs became touchstones of his presence. Emily often paused at the one where John's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his grin wide and boyish, his eyes full of mischief. She would trace the glass with her fingers, whispering stories of their adventures together so their children would know the sound of his laughter, the steadiness of his faith, the way he made ordinary days feel extraordinary. She carried his memory not as a wound but as a light, though grief pressed in waves. Nights were hardest, when the house grew quiet and she reached for a space in the bed that was no longer filled. On those nights she told their newborn son stories of his father. She told him that John had been brave, that he had fought to come back, that he had whispered his love until the very end. "You'll know him," she whispered into the soft hair of her baby. "Even if you never met him, you'll know him. Because I'll make sure his story lives with you." Josh, the younger brother who had entered Nutty Putty with John that night, carried his own kind of legacy. He wrestled with memories of the cave, the sound of his brother's voice weakening, the helplessness of realizing there was nothing he could do. Survivor's guilt pressed hard, but over time, it transformed into resolve. Josh spoke at safety gatherings, sharing not just the technical dangers of caving, but the human side of loss. "I was there," he would tell wide-eyed newcomers. "And I can tell you this, no thrill is worth a family's tears. No adventure is worth your last breath in the dark." His words carried weight, not because of diagrams or statistics, but because they came from a man who had held his brother's hand in the deepest shadows and emerged alone. For John's parents, the tragedy deepened their faith even as it tested it. They prayed not just for their son, but for every rescuer who had risked their life in those hours underground. They prayed for Emily, for the unborn child who would grow up with stories instead of memories. They prayed that John's name would be remembered not only for how he died, but for how he lived, with love, with joy, with faith. And slowly the narrative shifted. Yes, John became a cautionary tale in the caving world. But in his family's hearts, he became something larger, a testimony. His story was a reminder that life is fragile, that love is sacred, that every breath is borrowed time. Years later, Nutty Putty remained sealed, but people still came. Some were cavers who stood silently at the concrete entrance, hats in hand, honoring the one who never returned. Others were strangers who had read about John's final hours and felt compelled to pay respects. Flowers appeared from time to time, tucked against the weathered stone. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper carried messages like, "We remember you, John, and your story changed me." The cave was no longer a place of daring, it was a monument not to tragedy but to humanity. Emily's children grew up hearing about their father not as a ghost but as a presence woven into their lives. She showed them pictures, told them about his dreams of becoming a doctor, about his stubborn streak, about the way he prayed with her at night. She described how, in the cave's darkest hours, his thoughts had not been of himself but of them. His love for his family shaping even his final words. In those retellings, John was never just a man who died in a cave. He was a man who lived with purpose. And in the broader world, his story found permanence. Documentaries retold the harrowing rescue. Articles analyzed every detail of the failed pulley system, every twist of the limestone tunnel. Students of engineering, medicine, and rescue sciences studied his case as both tragedy and lesson. And yet, woven into the technicalities was something far more enduring. The reminder that behind every statistic is a heartbeat, a family, a story. John Edward Jones became more than a cautionary tale. He became a name that carried weight, a story that inspired change. Safety regulations grew stricter. Cavers approached the Earth's depths with renewed humility. His story saved lives precisely because it showed how easily one can be lost. But for his family, the greatest legacy was not in regulations or memorials. It was in love carried forward. Emily lived each day not just as a widow, but as a storyteller, ensuring that her children's lives would be filled with the presence of their father. She wanted them to know that John's story did not end in darkness, but in the light of the love he gave and the faith he carried. "He's still with us," she would say, her voice steady, her gaze clear. "Everywhere we go. In every prayer, every laugh, every moment we hold each other close." In the end, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed with stone and silence. But John's story was never buried. It lived in the hearts of his family, in the memories of rescuers, in the lessons of adventurers, and in the whispered prayers of strangers who had never met him but felt the weight of his struggle. The unfinished story of John Edward Jones was not about his final breath, but about the breaths carried on by those he loved. His children grew, his wife endured, his name spread. And in that way he remained, present, eternal, unforgotten. Nutty Putty held his body. But the world carried his story.